The water betrayed nothing at first glance. April 17th, 1989. A Monday morning that began like any other in Marlinton, West Virginia. Two fishermen casting lines into the Greenbrier River noticed something caught between fallen branches near the riverbank. A flash of blue fabric. A pale hand breaking the surface. The current gently swaying what they initially thought was a discarded mannequin. Until they saw her face. "I'll never forget it," recalled James Holcomb, one of the fishermen who made the discovery. Her eyes were open, looking right at the sky, like she was still asking for help. The body of 20-year-old Jessica Winters had been found, ending a 3-day search that had consumed every resident of this tight-knit Pocahontas County community, a town where most people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors brought casseroles when someone fell ill, where the annual Pioneer Days festival was the biggest event of the year. That April morning changed Marlinton forever. Sheriff Dale Morgan arrived within minutes, his radio call drawing half the county's limited law enforcement resources to the scene. Word spread through town faster than any official announcement could, the way news always traveled in a community of just 1,054 souls. By noon, dozens of residents lined the bridge overlooking the recovery operation, many in tears, others in stunned silence. "It was like the heart was ripped out of our town," said Margaret Wilson, who taught Jessica in 3rd grade. "In a place this small, we're all family, and one of our daughters was taken from us." The killer walked among them. For 36 years they wouldn't know who. If this kind of true crime analysis interests you, make sure to subscribe to Revealed Crime Cases. We uncover the stories that others have forgotten. I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. What happened to Jessica Winters in the peaceful mountains of West Virginia would remain unsolved for nearly 4 decades, but the truth, when it finally emerged, would devastate Jessica a community Marie Winters that never was the truly kind of healed person from its people in deepest Marlinton wound. said could outshine the sun. Born on August 12, 1968, at the small Pocahontas Memorial Hospital, she had lived all her 20 years in this mountain town, becoming as much a fixture as the historic depot that anchored Main Street. "Everyone knew Jessie," said Hannah Roberts, her best friend since kindergarten. "Not just knew of her, really knew her. She remembered your birthday, asked about your sick mother, offered to help when you were struggling. That's rare, even in a town this small." At Pocahontas County High School, Jessica had been a standout, though not in ways that sought the spotlight. Class of '87, she'd maintained a 3.9 GPA while working weekends at Parker's General Store. She ran track, sang in the choir, and tutored younger students struggling with math. Her senior yearbook listed her as most likely to leave and most likely to come back, a contradiction that perfectly captured her complex relationship with Marlinton. "She loved this town, but she wanted more," explained Thomas Winters, Jessica's father, sitting in the living room he'd maintained, largely unchanged since his daughter's death. A wall of photographs chronicled her growth, Jessica at 8 holding her first-place science fair ribbon, at 16 in her track uniform, at graduation with her honor cords. She used to say Marlinton gave her roots, but she needed to find her wings. Those wings were taking shape in the form of a pre-med program at West Virginia University. After completing 2 years at the community college in nearby Lewisburg, Jessica had been accepted for transfer to WVU in Morgantown that coming fall. Her dream, to become a doctor, and eventually return to serve the chronically underserved mountain communities of Pocahontas County. "Health care here was limited," explained Dr. Robert Simmons, the aging physician who had delivered Jessica and later became her mentor. Jessica saw how folks had to drive an hour or more for specialized care. She wanted to fix that. Even at 20, she had more purpose than most people find in a lifetime. Her morning jogs began during her junior year of high school. 6 days a week, regardless of weather, Jessica would lace up her blue Asics running shoes and follow the same 5-mile route along the Greenbrier River Trail. Starting at the old wooden trailhead near 9th Avenue, she'd head north along the converted railroad path, the flowing water always within view to her right, dense forests rising to her left. She loved that trail, said her mother, Catherine Winters, her voice softening at the memory. She said running there made her feel connected to something bigger, the mountains, the river, the sky. It was her thinking time. The trail was considered safe, a source of pride for Marlinton and a draw for tourists who came to hike, bike, and fish. Before Jessica's death, no one thought twice about a young woman running there alone. The community's innocence was another victim of what happened. In a town where everyone had multiple connections, Jessica's absence left countless holes in the fabric of daily life. She taught Sunday school at First Baptist Church. She volunteered at the senior center every Thursday, playing piano while elderly residents sang along to hymns and folk songs. During the annual Pioneer Days festival, she coordinated the children's activities, her patience legendary among frazzled parents. That girl never said no when someone needed help, recalled Mabel Thompson, 87, who received weekly visits from Jessica to help with groceries and medication sorting. But she wasn't a pushover. She had opinions and wasn't afraid to share them. Indeed, Jessica had recently become vocal at town council meetings about the need for more economic opportunities for young people in Pocahontas County. She'd written passionate letters to the Pocahontas Times about preserving both the natural beauty and ensuring a future for the next generation. Her last journal entry, found on her desk after her disappearance, revealed both her affection for her hometown and her restlessness. Marlinton holds my heart, but sometimes I feel like I'm trying to grow in a pot that's too small. Is it possible to love a place and still need to leave it? To honor your home by becoming more than it prepared you to be? She never got the chance to answer those questions. 3 days after writing those words, on Friday, April 14, 1989, Jessica Winters tied her blonde hair back in a ponytail, pulled on her favorite University of West Virginia sweatshirt against the morning chill, and headed out for her regular run along the Greenbrier River Trail. It was the last time anyone who loved her would see her alive. April in Pocahontas County brings a particular kind of renewal. The harshness of mountain winters gives way to wildflowers pushing through the forest floor, and the Greenbrier River runs high with snowmelt. Spring 1989 had been especially promising for Marlinton. The timber mill had hired back workers laid off the previous fall, a new restaurant had opened on Main Street, and the community was buzzing about summer tourists who would soon arrive to hike, fish, and paddle through their corner of Appalachia. Friday, April 14th began unseasonably warm, touching 68 degrees by mid-morning. Jessica Winters left her parents' two-story Victorian on 9th Avenue at 6:15 a.m., the same time she always departed for her run. Several neighbors later confirmed seeing her jog past, Mrs. Donaldson watering her early spring bulbs, Mr. Halstead collecting his newspaper, and Kyle Jenkins waiting for the school bus. She waved like always. Kyle, who was 12 at the time, remembered. She had her Walkman on and she was smiling. Just looked normal, you know? That's what made it so weird later. Everything seemed so ordinary that morning. Jessica's routine was clockwork. 5 miles along the Greenbrier River Trail, then home by 7:30 to shower before her 9 a.m. shift at Parker's General Store. When she hadn't returned by 8:15, her mother, Catherine, became concerned. By 8:45, she was frantic, calling Jessica's friends. By 9:30, when the store's owner, Betty Parker, phoned asking about Jessica's absence, Catherine contacted the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department. "We took it seriously right away," said retired Deputy Jim Landon. "This wasn't like Jessica. She didn't just not show up places, and in a town like Marlinton, someone not following their routine stands out immediately." Sheriff Dale Morgan dispatched his 3 available deputies to drive the length of the river trail, while he personally took Catherine's statement. By noon, when no sign of Jessica had been found, Morgan made a call that would have been unthinkable in Marlinton before that day. He requested assistance from the West Virginia State Police. Word spread through the town's unofficial channels, calls between neighbors, conversations at the lunch counter at Dory's Diner, announcements after services hastily organized at the town's 4 churches. By mid-afternoon, more than 200 volunteers had gathered at the First Baptist Church, where Jessica had taught Sunday school just 5 days earlier. Tom Riley, who owned the hardware store, remembered the scene. "I'd lived in Marlinton 40 years and never seen anything like it. Everyone came. Logger boys still in their work boots. Teachers straight from school. The mayor organizing search teams while the church ladies set up a command center with phones and maps. We were scared, but there was also this sense that we'd find her, because that's what communities like ours do. We take care of our own." Sheriff Morgan, overwhelmed by the volunteer response but grateful, divided the growing crowd into teams. They methodically searched downtown Marlinton, calling Jessica's name down alleyways and checking vacant buildings. Others drove the winding mountain roads leading out of town, scanning ditches and overlooks. The largest groups were assigned sections of the Greenbrier River Trail, combing through underbrush and scanning the water's surface. As darkness fell on that first day, emergency services set up floodlights along the most promising areas of the trail. The search continued through the night, with volunteers rotating in shifts, fueled by coffee and sandwiches provided by local businesses. Temperature dropped to 42 degrees, and a light rain began to fall around midnight, making conditions miserable for searchers and potentially dangerous for Jessica if she was injured somewhere exposed to the elements. Saturday morning brought reinforcements: volunteer fire departments from neighboring communities, search and rescue teams with trained dogs, and even a helicopter borrowed from a TV news station in Roanoke, Virginia. The search area expanded to a 15-mile radius around Jessica's last known position. "We found one of her hair ties about 2 miles up the trail," remembered State Trooper Anthony Williams. "It was blue, matched the description of what she was wearing, but we couldn't tell if it had been dropped that day or earlier. Still, it gave us a direction." By Saturday afternoon, authorities acknowledged publicly what many had begun to fear privately: that Jessica's disappearance likely involved foul play. The community that had maintained optimism now faced a darker possibility. Parents kept children indoors. Groups of men, many armed, gathered on corners talking in low voices. The search continued, but the tenor had changed. "You could feel it shift," said Pastor Robert Miller of First Baptist. Friday was panic and worry. Saturday became anger and fear. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not in Marlinton. Sunday dawned clear and cool. Church services across town became impromptu prayer vigils, with many congregants moving between denominations in a show of unity rarely seen before. The Winters family, physically exhausted and emotionally shattered after 3 days without sleep, sat in the front pew of First Baptist, while a rotating group of community members kept them supplied with food they couldn't eat and reassurances that grew increasingly hollow. It was 7:38 a.m. on Monday, April 17th, when James Holcomb and Pete Davidson made their grim discovery. The two retirees, fishing on a secluded bend of the Greenbrier River about 4 miles downstream from town, spotted what they initially thought was debris caught in a fallen tree that extended into the water. Pete saw the blue fabric first, Holcomb later testified. "Thought it was somebody's trash. Then I saw the hand. It was so pale, just floating there." The men immediately radioed for help using their emergency channel, having brought a CB radio on their fishing trip, a common practice in rural areas with spotty phone service. Sheriff Morgan arrived within 20 minutes, followed closely by a hastily assembled recovery team. The recovery operation was complex. The body, quickly confirmed to be Jessica Winters, had become entangled in submerged branches, and authorities were careful to preserve potential evidence. A team of 4 men worked in the cold water for nearly an hour before they were able to bring Jessica to shore. She had multiple scratches on her arms and face, noted the medical examiner's preliminary report. Her WVU sweatshirt was torn at the shoulder. The body showed signs of having been in the water approximately 48-72 hours, consistent with a death occurring Friday morning. News reached town before Jessica's body did. Catherine and Thomas Winters were notified personally by Sheriff Morgan, who drove back to be the one to tell them. Their screams could be heard down the block. Neighbors gathered on porches, holding hands or embracing, as word passed from house to house. By mid-afternoon, the town that had mobilized so quickly to search now found itself paralyzed by grief and fear. Shops closed early. Schools announced they would remain closed the following day. The volunteer fire department set up a rotation to patrol streets that had never needed patrolling before. "It broke us," said longtime Marlinton Mayor Harold Phillips. "Not just losing Jessica, who everyone loved, but losing our sense of safety. Suddenly we were looking at our neighbors differently. Someone among us had done this terrible thing, or a stranger had come into our town undetected. Either possibility was terrifying." The medical examiner's full report, delivered Wednesday, confirmed what many had feared. Jessica had been sexually assaulted before being killed by manual strangulation. The water had washed away crucial evidence, but marks on her neck indicated significant force. Her body had likely been in the river since shortly after her disappearance Friday morning. In the days that followed, Marlinton transformed. Doors once left unlocked were now double-bolted. Parents began driving children to bus stops they had previously walked to alone. The Greenbrier River Trail, once the pride of the community, stood eerily empty even as spring brought perfect weather for outdoor recreation. "We lost more than Jessica," reflected Hannah Roberts, who had been her best friend. "We lost Marlinton as we knew it. Our innocence, our trust. Even after they caught him all those years later, we never got that back." The community rallied around the Winters family with meals, donations, and constant presence. Jessica's funeral at First Baptist Church overflowed with mourners, with hundreds standing outside in the rain listening to the service through speakers hastily set up by the high school's audiovisual club. As April turned to May, the investigation continued, but leads were scarce. The clear waters of the Greenbrier, usually a source of pride and recreation for Pocahontas County, had erased too many clues. Sheriff Morgan and his deputies interviewed dozens of local men, but without physical evidence to connect anyone to the crime, they could only document alibis and look for inconsistencies. By Memorial Day, the daily rhythm of Marlinton had resumed its familiar pattern, but with an undercurrent of sorrow and suspicion that clung to every interaction. Jessica Winters's senior portrait appeared on posters in shop windows alongside the word justice, a silent reminder that somewhere, perhaps among them, her killer remained free. The Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department of 1989 operated out of a modest brick building on Main Street in Marlinton. With just Sheriff Dale Morgan, 4 full-time deputies, 2 part-time deputies, and a single dispatcher, the department was equipped to handle the occasional DUI, domestic dispute, or petty theft. Not a complex homicide investigation. "We were outmatched from day one," admitted Morgan, now 78 and living in Florida. "Our department had investigated exactly 0 murders in the 10 years before Jessica's death. The most sophisticated equipment we had was a Polaroid camera and some fingerprint powder. DNA testing? That was something we'd heard about on television. The department's evidence room was a converted supply closet with a padlock. Their entire annual budget would have funded a major city's police department for about 3 days. When Jessica's body was recovered from the Greenbrier River, Morgan made an immediate call to the West Virginia State Police headquarters in Charleston. "I knew we needed help," Morgan said. "This wasn't just about solving a case. This was Jessica. This was personal." Within hours of the discovery, State Police Captain William Haynes arrived with a team of 4 investigators and a mobile evidence collection unit, a customized van containing more technology than the entire Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department. The FBI also offered assistance, sending Special Agent Thomas Reynolds as a consultant, though not officially taking over the case. "It was a jurisdictional dance," explained former state police investigator Robert Campbell. "The murder occurred in Pocahontas County, so Morgan had primary jurisdiction, but he had the wisdom to know when to step aside and let those with more resources and experience lead certain aspects of the investigation." The Marlinton Courthouse, a stately stone building constructed in 1894, became the command center. Its grand jury room transformed into a war room, with photos of the crime scene, maps of the Greenbrier River Trail, and timelines covering the walls. The scene resembled something from a city police department, jarringly out of place in rural West Virginia. The investigation began with the physical evidence, limited though it was. Jessica's body, after being photographed in situ, was transported to the state medical examiner's office in Charleston for autopsy. Her torn clothing was carefully preserved for potential fiber evidence. Soil and vegetation samples were collected from the riverbank near where she was found. Casts were made of several shoe prints discovered along the trail near where her hair tie had been recovered. "We were fighting the river," Campbell explained. "Water is the enemy of evidence. It washes away biological traces, destroys fingerprints, carries away fibers and hairs. Plus, we were working with 1989 technology, not the sophisticated methods available today." Still, the investigation moved forward methodically. Officers conducted a door-to-door canvass of every residence within a 2-mile radius of the Greenbrier River Trail, documenting where each resident claimed to be on the morning of April 14th. More than 60 volunteers were interviewed about what they had seen during the search efforts, in case anyone had unknowingly encountered evidence or even the killer returning to the scene. The first week produced 3 primary suspects, each local men known to frequently use the trail during early morning hours. One was a recently paroled sex offender who had returned to Marlinton 6 months earlier. Another was a local handyman known to have expressed interest in Jessica previously. The third was a married high school teacher, rumored to have inappropriate relationships with former students. Each man was brought to the courthouse for questioning. The interrogation room was simple: a table, chairs, and a tape recorder. Without sophisticated forensic evidence to confront them with, investigators relied on interview techniques, looking for inconsistencies, unusual nervousness, or specific knowledge of the crime that hadn't been released to the public. "You get a feel for people who are hiding something," said Morgan. "But a feeling isn't evidence. We needed something concrete to make an arrest." The community, meanwhile, had transformed from search party to amateur detective agency. Tips flooded in, hundreds of them. A truck scene parked near the trailhead. A stranger buying gas at Parker's station the day before. A local man with unexplained scratches on his arms. Each required follow-up, stretching the already thin resources. "People meant well," said Deputy Jim Landon. "But for every legitimate tip, we got 20 that were just rumors, speculation, or long-standing grudges being aired under the guise of helping the investigation." The sex offender was eliminated as a suspect when bus ticket records and multiple witnesses confirmed he had been in Charleston from April 13th, 15, for a mandatory parole meeting and job interview. The handyman's alibi, working on plumbing at the Methodist church, was verified by the pastor and 3 parishioners. The teacher underwent 2 polygraph examinations with inconclusive results, remaining on the suspect list but with no evidence to justify an arrest. By the investigation's second week, the state police mobile unit remained parked outside the courthouse, but half the additional officers had been recalled to other duties. The FBI consultant returned to Quantico. The everyday reality of limited resources in rural law enforcement began to reassert itself. Then came the first major lead. A woman walking her dog along the trail discovered Jessica's Walkman cassette player, half buried in mud, about 2 miles from where her body had been found. The cassette inside, Whitney Houston's second album, was still cued to "So Emotional," the song Jessica's roommate said she had been listening to repeatedly that week. The discovery energized investigators. The Walkman was sent to the State Police Crime Lab, where technicians carefully dried it and processed it for fingerprints. 3 partial prints were recovered, 2 matched Jessica, but the third was unidentified. In 1989, without computerized fingerprint databases, this meant physically comparing the print to those of every suspect, a painstaking process. "We fingerprinted 27 local men," recalled Morgan. "Everyone who had access to the trail, no criminal record required. Most agreed voluntarily. A few required some persuasion or a gentle reminder about how refusal would look to their neighbors. None matched. The state police brought in tracking dogs to work backward from where the Walkman was found, hoping to establish a more precise location for the attack. The dogs followed a scent trail that veered off the main path about a half-mile from the Walkman's location, leading to a small clearing that showed signs of disturbance: flattened grass, broken branches, and what might have been drag marks leading toward the river. "We finally had a crime scene," said Campbell, "but it was 2 weeks old, exposed to rain, wildlife, and the search parties who had already covered this ground. Still, the clearing yielded important evidence, a distinctive boot print that didn't match emergency responders or search volunteers, and 3 cigarette butts of a brand not commonly sold in Marlinton. The lab determined the cigarettes were Marlboro Red 100s, available at any gas station in America. The boot print, however, was more distinctive, size 11 Wolverine work boots with a specific wear pattern on the left heel. Investigators canvassed local stores that sold work boots, compiling a list of everyone who had purchased that specific brand and size in the past year. 17 names emerged. 16 were interviewed and their boots examined. One man, a timber worker, had moved away just days after Jessica's murder. "We thought we had him," Morgan said. Mitchell Carver, 32 years old, worked at the mill, kept to himself mostly. Left town April 20th, supposedly for a job in Kentucky. We put out an interstate alert. 2 deputies drove to Lexington, Kentucky, where Carver had reportedly relocated. They found him working at a lumber yard, surprised but cooperative. His boots matched the brand but showed a different wear pattern. His fingerprints didn't match the partial on the Walkman. A search of his former residence and vehicle in West Virginia revealed nothing connecting him to Jessica or the crime scene. Another dead end. By summer, the investigation had generated 1,243 pages of reports, 201 formal interviews, and 87 pieces of physical evidence. What it hadn't produced was an arrest. The state police mobile unit departed Marlinton in late June. The courthouse war room was dismantled, its contents boxed and moved to a dedicated storage room at the sheriff's department. "We never stopped working the case," insisted Morgan. "But other crimes happened. Other victims needed us. Resources got thinner. Leads dried up. Days between case meetings turned into weeks, then months. The Jessica Winters murder became what law enforcement calls a cold case. Not forgotten, but no longer actively generating new investigative avenues. For the officers who had thrown themselves into the investigation, this reality was personally devastating. "I took it home with me every night," Landon admitted. "My wife said I talked about Jessica in my sleep. These small-town cases get under your skin because the victim isn't just a name on a report. She's someone you've known since she was born. I watched Jessica grow up, handed out candy to her at Halloween, saw her run track at the high school. Then suddenly I'm looking at crime scene photos of her body. That changes you." For the Winters family, the cooling of the investigation brought a particular kind of torment. Every unexplained car outside their home raised hopes that news was coming. Every phone call might be the one telling them an arrest had been made. The community, too, existed in a state of suspended animation, their sense of safety contingent on a resolution that seemed increasingly unlikely. Morgan kept a copy of Jessica's senior portrait on his desk until his retirement in 2003. The case file, eventually filling 3 cardboard boxes, occupied a prominent place in the department's evidence storage. New deputies were familiarized with the details during their orientation, a ritual that continued for decades. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened with today's technology," reflected Morgan. DNA databases, cell phone tracking, surveillance cameras everywhere. Would we have caught him in a week? Would Jessica have justice now instead of 36 years later? What time is it there? Drop a comment and let us know. Our audience spans all time zones, and we're curious about when and where you're watching this story unfold. If you're finding this case as compelling and heartbreaking as we do, please like and share this video. Getting these stories in front of more viewers not only helps our channel grow, but sometimes brings forward new information on cold cases from viewers who might have connections to the communities involved. Catherine Winters refused to leave the house where her daughter's laughter once echoed through hallways now silent. For 36 years, she lived in the white Victorian on 9th Avenue, its paint refreshed regularly by neighbors who understood that maintaining the home was their way of honoring both the living and the dead. "I stay because this is where Jessica would come home to if she could," Catherine told the Pocahontas Times in 1999. on the 10th anniversary of her daughter's murder. Moving would feel like giving up, like telling her we've stopped waiting. The waiting took many forms. Every morning, Catherine would rise at 6:15 a.m., the exact time Jessica had left for her final run, and sit in the front room's bay window watching the street outside. The ritual wasn't a conscious decision at first, but over months and then years, it became as essential as breathing. Some people thought it was morbid, said Thomas Winters, who remained by his wife's side despite the strain grief placed on their marriage. But Catherine said she was standing watch, making sure Jessica wasn't forgotten, making sure whoever did this knew someone was still looking for them. Jessica's portrait, her senior photograph from Pocahontas County High School, occupied the central place above the living room mantel. In it, she wore a blue sweater that brought out her eyes, her blonde hair falling just below her shoulders, her smile revealing the slight gap between her front teeth she'd always been self-conscious about. Over the decades, the sun never touched that photograph. Catherine made sure of it, adjusting curtains throughout the day to protect the colors from fading. "That photo is how I keep her alive in this house," Catherine explained. "Sometimes when I'm alone, I talk to it. Tell her about my day, about what's changed in town, about the investigation. I know it might sound crazy to some, but mothers understand." Every April 17th, the day Jessica's body was found, Marlinton Methodist Church hosted a memorial service. The first year, over 400 people attended, nearly half the town's population. By the 5th anniversary, attendance had dropped to about 150. By the 10th, less than 100. But even 3 decades later, a loyal group of at least 40 community members would join the Winters family, singing Jessica's favorite hymns and sharing memories that grew more distant but no less cherished. "The community never forgot," said Pastor Eliza Hamilton, who began leading the memorial service in 2007. "Even people who moved to Marlinton years after Jessica's death understood this was part of our town's ritual. New residents would attend to show respect, even without having known her personally." Through the years, Catherine became a quiet but persistent advocate for missing and murdered women. She compiled newspaper clippings about similar cases across West Virginia and neighboring states, corresponding with other grieving families. Her dining room table disappeared beneath folders organized by location, date, and case status. She was looking for patterns, Thomas explained. Connections the police might have missed. She'd send information to Sheriff Morgan or, later, to his successors. Some of them were patient about it, others less so, but she never stopped. The community's support manifested in countless small ways that accumulated over decades. The Winters Watch, as locals called it, ensured that someone always checked on Catherine and Thomas daily. For years, dinner appeared on their porch each evening, prepared by a rotating group of church members and friends. When Thomas's health declined in the early 2000s, neighbors took turns driving him to medical appointments 2 hours away in Roanoke. "In a small town, grief is communal," observed longtime Marlinton Mayor Harold Phillips. "The Winters' loss was our loss. Their wait for justice was our wait. We couldn't bring Jessica back, but we could make sure her parents weren't carrying this burden alone." Catherine's determination never wavered, even as her hair grayed and her steps slowed. She attended every new deputy's swearing in at the sheriff's department, introducing herself and quietly mentioning that her daughter's case remained unsolved. She maintained a relationship with each new investigator assigned to the cold case unit, sending birthday cards and Christmas wishes alongside gentle reminders about evidence that might benefit from retesting as technology advanced. She was never angry, never bitter, recalled Deputy Sarah Collins, who joined the department in 2015. Just resolute, she wouldn't let Jessica become just another file in storage. Because of Catherine, every officer in that department knew Jessica's face, her story, the details of her case. Catherine kept her daughter present. In 2019, on the 30th anniversary of Jessica's death, Catherine stood at the memorial service looking more fragile than ever at 76. But when she spoke, her voice carried the same unwavering conviction. "My daughter deserves justice," she told those gathered, "and I will wait as long as it takes. Whoever did this should know mothers don't give up, ever. She didn't know then that her wait was nearing its end. July 17, 2025, began as an unremarkable summer day at Watauga State Park. Located just 15 minutes from Marlinton, the park's swimming area had served as the community's respite from Appalachian summer heat for generations. Children splashed in the designated swimming section while parents and grandparents watched from beach chairs along the shore, a timeless scene that could have been from any decade. Melissa Daniels, 53, a lifelong Marlinton resident who worked as a nurse at Pocahontas Memorial Hospital, had brought her grandchildren for their weekly swim. As she watched the children play, she struck up conversation with another grandmother seated nearby, Rebecca Thornton, 55, who taught 5th grade at Marlinton Elementary. "We weren't close friends," Melissa would later explain to investigators. "More like acquaintances who'd known each other forever, the way people do in small towns. Our kids had gone to school together. We'd see each other at the grocery store or church functions and chat, but never anything deep." Their conversation that day began with the usual small talk, complimenting each other's grandchildren, commenting on the perfect water temperature, discussing an upcoming community fundraiser. Then it shifted to reminiscing about how they'd both spent summers at this same swimming area as children themselves. "Remember how they used to have that big wooden raft out in the deeper section?" Rebecca asked. "They took it out after the Winters girl was killed. Too many parents worried about letting kids swim out that far where they couldn't see them." The mention of Jessica Winters might have been just another passing reference to a tragedy that had shaped their community, but something in Rebecca's tone caught Melissa's attention. She said it oddly, Melissa recalled. Not just sad, the way people usually sound when mentioning Jessica, but tense, like she was testing my reaction. What followed was a moment of rare candor between two women who had spent decades carrying private suspicions they had never fully articulated, even to themselves. "I always wondered about Roy," Rebecca said quietly, eyes still on the children playing in the water. "Bennett?" Melissa asked, though she already knew which Roy her companion meant. There was only one Roy in Marlinton prominent enough to need no last name. Rebecca nodded almost imperceptibly. Roy Bennett had been a pillar of Marlinton since the early 1980s, owner of Bennett's Hardware on Main Street, president of the Chamber of Commerce for 15 years, deacon at First Baptist Church, and volunteer firefighter. His store had sponsored Little League teams for decades. His annual Christmas light display drew visitors from surrounding counties. His donations funded the new playground equipment at the elementary school. He was, by all public appearances, the model small-town businessman and citizen. "Why Roy?" Melissa asked, though her heart had begun beating faster. Rebecca glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "I worked at the hardware store part-time in '89, when it still belonged to Tom Riley before Roy bought him out in '92. The Monday after they found Jessica, Roy came in with scratches on his forearms, said he'd been clearing brush on his property over the weekend. Lots of people had scratches from searching through undergrowth," Melissa pointed out, playing devil's advocate despite the chill that had settled over her in the summer heat. "That's what I told myself," Rebecca agreed. But he hadn't joined any of the search parties, said he had family obligations in Elkins that weekend. And there was something else, his boots. He always wore these Wolverine work boots, had the same brand for years. But that Monday he had brand new ones. Tom commented on it, and Roy said he'd lost his old pair. Melissa's breath caught. "The boot prints they found." Rebecca nodded. "I didn't connect it then. It wasn't until years later when I overheard Sheriff Morgan talking about the case at the diner, about boot prints they'd found that matched Wolverine work boots. Size 11. Roy wore size 11. "Why didn't you say something?" Melissa asked, though she already suspected the answer. The same reason she had never voiced her own suspicions. Who would believe me? Roy Bennett, respected businessman, against the part-time clerk who'd only been working there 3 months. Besides, I didn't have proof, just observations. Rebecca twisted her wedding ring nervously. And my husband worked for Roy later, after he bought the store. We needed that job. The conversation might have ended there, another quiet exchange of long-held suspicions that led nowhere. But Melissa found herself sharing her own unsettling memory. The fall after Jessica died, I was working night shift at the hospital. Roy came in around 2 a.m. with a cut on his hand that needed stitches. Said he'd been fixing something in his garage and the knife slipped. Melissa paused, still uncomfortable with the memory after all these years. While I was cleaning the wound, he started talking about Jessica, out of nowhere, about how tragic it was, how the killer would never be caught because the evidence was probably all destroyed in the river. That's not that strange, Rebecca said. Everyone talked about the case back then. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. He knew details that hadn't been in the newspaper, about marks on her neck, about her Walkman being found, and he had this look, I can't explain it, almost satisfied when he talked about evidence being washed away. Rebecca's face had gone pale. Did you tell anyone? I mentioned it to a deputy I was dating then. He said they'd already cleared everyone who bought those boots. Said Bennett had a solid alibi. He was supposedly at a business meeting in Charleston that morning. The two women fell silent, watching their grandchildren play in water that reflected the summer sky, both grappling with the weight of suspicions they'd carried for decades. You know, Rebecca finally said, my cousin works for the state police now, in their cold case unit. She was just telling me last weekend that they're using some new DNA technique that can extract profiles from samples that were too degraded before. Would they reopen the case based on just feelings we had? Melissa asked. I don't know. But Jessica's mother still lives in that house on 9th Avenue, still waiting for justice. Rebecca met Melissa's eyes directly. Don't you think she deserves to know someone's still looking? The evidence boxes for the Jessica Winters case had been moved 7 times over 36 years, from the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department to the state police headquarters in Charleston, back to Marlinton when a new sheriff wanted to review everything, then to various storage facilities as administrations changed and space needs evolved. Despite these transitions, the chain of custody remained meticulously documented, a testament to the importance placed on preserving whatever might someday lead to justice. In August 2025, those boxes arrived at the West Virginia State Crime Lab's newly expanded cold case division in Charleston. The facility, renovated just 2 years earlier with federal grant money, housed technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators of 1989. When this case was originally investigated, DNA testing was in its infancy, explained Dr. Eleanor Simmons, director of the Cold Case Division. The techniques available then required relatively large, well-preserved samples. Today, we can extract profiles from samples thousands of times smaller and significantly degraded. The lab's first priority was Jessica's clothing, which had been carefully preserved despite exposure to river water. Using a technique called MVAC, essentially a wet vacuum system, technicians collected microscopic cellular material that had remained trapped in the fabric fibers of her torn sweatshirt. Traditional swabbing might miss 90% of DNA on porous surfaces like clothing, Dr. Simmons noted. The MVAC can recover cellular material embedded deep in the weave of fabrics even after decades in storage. The cigarette butts found near the suspected attack site, dismissed in 1989 as too water-damaged for useful analysis, now underwent a process called methylation analysis, a technique that can extract DNA from samples previously considered hopeless. Most promising was the partial fingerprint from Jessica's Walkman. Using digital enhancement algorithms developed for national security applications, technicians were able to clarify ridge patterns that had been indistinct in the original analysis. We're not creating evidence that wasn't there, emphasized Dr. Simmons. We're simply using better tools to see what was always present, but beyond the technological reach of earlier investigators. While the lab worked, Lieutenant Sarah Matthews assembled a new investigative team focused exclusively on the Winters case. Their first task was a comprehensive review of the original investigation files, identifying witnesses who needed to be re-interviewed and leads that warranted fresh examination. One name kept appearing in the periphery of the original investigation, Lieutenant Matthews would later testify. Roy Bennett was mentioned by multiple witnesses as someone who used the trail regularly, who knew Jessica from her work at Parker's General Store, who had unexplained scratches after her disappearance. Yet his interview was cursory at best, a single page in a file containing thousands. The team discovered that Bennett's alibi, a business meeting in Charleston the morning of Jessica's disappearance, had never been fully verified. Hotel records showed he had indeed reserved a room at the Charleston Marriott for April 13, 1989, but there was no record of him actually checking in. Credit card statements, subpoenaed from archives, showed no activity in Charleston during the time frame. His alibi was essentially accepted on his word, said Detective James Wilson, part of the cold case team. That wouldn't happen today, but in a small town where everyone knows everyone, it's not surprising. Bennett was respected, well-liked. No one wanted to believe he could be involved. As the investigation progressed, the team built a comprehensive profile of Roy Bennett and his connections to Marlinton. Born and raised in nearby Lewisburg, he had moved to Marlinton in 1982 to work at the hardware store he would eventually purchase. He joined the volunteer fire department within months, the Chamber of Commerce the following year, and became a deacon at First Baptist Church, the same church Jessica attended, in 1987. He embedded himself in every aspect of community life, observed Detective Wilson. Chamber of Commerce, church leadership, business association, youth sports sponsorships. He created an identity as an indispensable pillar of Marlinton. This community standing had potentially shielded him from scrutiny in 1989. The deputy who conducted his original interview, now deceased, had been a fellow deacon at First Baptist. The business meeting alibi had been corroborated by another local businessman who, records showed, had received a loan from Bennett the following month. In September 2025, investigators conducted new interviews with 27 people who had known Bennett in 1989. Former employees described him as demanding but fair. Church members recalled his generous donations and regular attendance, but a different picture emerged from women who had worked closely with him. He could be intense with female employees, reported a woman who had worked at the hardware store in the early 1990s. Nothing you could definitely call harassment, just lingering too long, standing too close, making comments about appearance that weren't exactly inappropriate but made you uncomfortable. Another woman who had been a teenager when she worked at the store part-time described how Bennett would often offer her rides home. I always made excuses. Something about him made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have explained why. Most significantly, investigators discovered that Bennett had been briefly questioned in a 1987 incident involving a female jogger who reported being followed on the Greenbrier River Trail. No charges were filed, and the incident report was vague. The jogger, now living in North Carolina, told investigators in 2025 that Bennett had been unusually interested in her running routine when she made purchases at his store. He would ask when I usually ran, what parts of the trail I preferred, she recalled. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly, maybe interested in running himself. Looking back, it feels different. By October, the forensic results began returning from the lab. The enhanced fingerprint analysis from the Walkman revealed 7 points of comparison with Bennett's prints on file from his volunteer firefighter background check. Not enough for absolute identification, but sufficient to establish him as a person of interest. The DNA analysis proved more definitive. Male DNA recovered from Jessica's sweatshirt showed familial markers consistent with Bennett's paternal line. To confirm a direct match, investigators needed a contemporary sample from Bennett himself. This is where investigation becomes chess, explained Lieutenant Matthews. We had enough to be highly suspicious, but not enough for an arrest warrant or even a court order for DNA. We needed to obtain a sample without alerting Bennett that he was under scrutiny. The solution came through careful surveillance. Bennett, now 68, maintained regular habits, coffee each morning at the same diner, followed by a visit to the post office. Investigators retrieved his discarded coffee cup, securing multiple DNA samples from the lid and rim. The lab results arrived on October 28, 2025, a 99.97% match to the DNA found on Jessica's clothing. That was our moment, recalled Lieutenant Matthews. After 36 years, we could finally say with scientific certainty that we knew who had killed Jessica Winters. But DNA alone wasn't enough. The team spent November building a comprehensive case that would withstand the scrutiny of a trial. They established a timeline showing Bennett had the opportunity to commit the crime despite his alibi. They documented his pattern of interest in female joggers. They compiled financial records showing he had purchased new boots the day after Jessica's disappearance, replacing the same brand and style he had worn for years. Most damning was what they found when executing a search warrant on a storage unit Bennett maintained in Lewisburg. Hidden inside a locked toolbox was a small plastic bag containing a blue hair elastic and a cassette case for Whitney Houston's second album. The items had no fingerprints. They had been carefully wiped. But their presence could not be innocently explained. Some killers keep trophies, Detective Wilson explained. Items that allow them to relive the crime, to maintain a connection to the victim. Finding these items was the final piece that transformed a strong circumstantial case into something we believed would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. On December 3, 2025, as Marlinton prepared for its annual Christmas parade, an event Roy Bennett had helped organize for decades, the investigative team prepared for an arrest that would shatter the community's understanding of a man they thought they knew. If you're finding this case as compelling as we do, we need your help to reach others who appreciate true crime analysis. This isn't just about likes or subscribers. It's about building a community that values justice for victims like Jessica. Take a moment right now to share this video with someone who understands the importance of cold cases finally being solved. Together, we can ensure these stories, and the lessons they teach us about persistence and justice, reach those who need to hear them. Roy Bennett had been Marlinton's model citizen for 36 years. His hardware store on Main Street served as more than just a business. It was a community hub where farmers discussed the weather, hunters compared notes on the season, and homeowners sought advice on projects. The annual Christmas display in his storefront windows drew families from across Pocahontas County. His donations funded everything from Little League uniforms to the restoration of the historic courthouse clock tower. He was the first person you'd call when you needed something done in this town, said Mayor Patricia Collins, who had worked closely with Bennett on the Chamber of Commerce for over a decade. Fundraiser for the volunteer fire department. Roy would organize it. New playground equipment for the elementary school. Roy would not only donate but show up with his truck to help install it. This carefully cultivated image made the events of December 4, 2025, all the more stunning to the residents of Marlinton. At 6:15 a.m., the exact time Jessica Winters had begun her final run 36 years earlier, a team of state police officers and Pocahontas County deputies surrounded Bennett's two-story colonial home on Maple Street. Lieutenant Sarah Matthews, leading the operation, had insisted on the symbolic timing. For 36 years, he woke up every morning knowing what he'd done while Jessica's family woke up to her absence, Matthews would later explain. It seemed fitting that his last morning of freedom would begin at the same time her last morning of life had. Bennett answered the door in his bathrobe, seemingly unsurprised by the officers on his porch. According to the arrest report, he simply nodded when Matthews identified herself and stated he was under arrest for the murder of Jessica Winters. "I always wondered if this day would come," he reportedly said as officers handcuffed him. "Took you long enough." News of the arrest spread through Marlinton with the same lightning speed that had characterized the announcement of Jessica's disappearance decades earlier. By 8 a.m., a crowd had gathered outside the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Office where Bennett was being processed. By noon, national news vans were setting up satellite equipment on Main Street. For many residents, the arrest created a cognitive dissonance that was almost physically painful. The respected business owner, the generous community leader, the man who had comforted Jessica's parents at her funeral, was the same man who had taken their daughter's life. "It's like finding out your favorite uncle is a monster," said Michael Peterson, who had worked at Bennett's Hardware as a teenager in the early 2000s. "You're trying to reconcile two completely different people in your head and it just doesn't compute." The question on everyone's mind: how had Bennett escaped detection for so long? The answer lay partly in the limitations of 1989 forensic science, but more significantly in the social dynamics of small-town America. Bennett had been interviewed during the original investigation, but only briefly, and by a deputy who had known him for years. His alibi, the business meeting in Charleston, had been accepted without thorough verification. His replacement of boots, similar to those that left prints at the crime scene, had gone unnoticed because investigators focused only on local purchases, while Bennett had bought his new boots in Lewisburg. In small communities, there's often a reluctance to suspect certain people, explained Dr. Elaine Hartman, a criminologist who later studied the case. Especially those who hold positions of respect or authority. It creates a kind of cognitive blind spot for investigators who are part of that same community. Bennett had exploited this blind spot masterfully. His increased community involvement after Jessica's murder, joining more committees, making larger donations, becoming more visible in local charity work, had effectively been hiding in plain sight, creating an identity so at odds with that of a killer that few could imagine the connection. He used our trust as camouflage, observed Sheriff David Harrison. Every good deed was another layer of protection, another reason why no one would look too closely at him. The evidence against Bennett, presented at his preliminary hearing on December 18, 2025, was damning. The DNA match between samples recovered from Jessica's clothing and Bennett's discarded coffee cup was 99.97%, a statistical near certainty. The enhanced fingerprint analysis showed 7 points of comparison between a partial print on Jessica's Walkman and Bennett's prints on file from his volunteer firefighter background check. Most compelling was the timeline investigators had reconstructed. Hotel records showed Bennett checking out of the Charleston Marriott at 5:30 a.m. on April 14, 1989, not staying for the business meeting as he had claimed. The drive from Charleston to Marlinton took approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes, placing him back in town around 7:45 a.m. Jessica had begun her run at 6:15 a.m. and was reported missing by 8:45 a.m. Bennett's whereabouts during that critical window had never been verified in the original investigation. Then there were the trophies found in his Lewisburg storage unit, Jessica's hair elastic and the empty cassette case for the Whitney Houston album she had been listening to when she disappeared. DNA testing confirmed microscopic traces of Jessica's skin cells on the elastic, preserved in the sealed plastic bag for 36 years. Some killers need to maintain a connection to their victims, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Marcus Reynolds, who consulted on the case. These items allowed Bennett to revisit the crime whenever he chose, while maintaining his public persona as the grieving community member. The community's reaction to these revelations unfolded in stages. Initial disbelief gave way to anger, not just at Bennett, but at a system that had failed to identify him sooner. This was followed by a painful self-examination, as residents questioned their own interactions with him over the decades. "I let him babysit my daughters," said Elizabeth Simmons, visibly shaken at a community meeting held at the Methodist Church a week after the arrest. "He sponsored their softball team. He gave them jobs at the store when they were teenagers, all this time." For others, hindsight revealed warning signs that had been dismissed or rationalized away. Former female employees came forward with stories of uncomfortable interactions, nothing explicitly criminal, but a pattern of boundary-testing behavior that took on new significance in light of the arrest. He would find reasons to be alone with female staff, recalled Jennifer Davis, who had worked at the hardware store in the mid-1990s. Inventory counts in the storage room, special projects after hours. Nothing ever happened to me, but there was always this tension, this feeling that he was waiting for an opportunity. Most disturbing was the revelation that Bennett had maintained a detailed awareness of the investigation over the years. Searches of his home computer revealed he had collected and organized news articles about Jessica's case, cold case investigation techniques, and advances in forensic DNA technology. He had attended community fundraisers for the sheriff's department that included tours of their facilities, potentially giving him insight into evidence storage procedures. "He was studying us while we should have been studying him," admitted former Sheriff Dale Morgan, now in his late 70s. "He knew exactly what we had and what we didn't have. He probably knew more about the case file than some of my deputies did. For Catherine Winters, now 82, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. The justice she had waited for had finally arrived, but with it came the painful knowledge that her daughter's killer had been in her presence countless times over the decades, at memorial services, community events, even occasionally bringing food to her home in those early years as part of the community support effort. He looked me in the eye at her funeral, Catherine told reporters, her voice steady despite her age. He held my hand and told me they would find whoever did this. All these years I've been waiting for justice while he's been pretending to wait alongside me. The preliminary hearing was held in the same courthouse where the original investigation had been coordinated. The grand jury room where evidence had once been displayed was now a modern courtroom with digital displays and recording equipment. Bennett, dressed in an orange jumpsuit rather than his usual carefully pressed business attire, appeared smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his true nature. He entered a plea of not guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence. His court-appointed attorney requested a change of venue, arguing that a fair trial would be impossible in Pocahontas County where emotions ran so high. The judge granted this motion, scheduling the trial to take place in Charleston. As Bennett was led from the courtroom, he passed within feet of Catherine Winters, who had insisted on attending, despite her family's concerns about her health. Their eyes met briefly, the mother who had never stopped seeking justice, and the man who had hidden the truth for nearly 4 decades. In that moment, Catherine would later say, I saw something I'd never seen in all the years I'd known Roy Bennett. I saw the real man behind the mask, and I knew without any doubt that he was the one who took my Jessica. The community of Marlinton, meanwhile, began the painful process of reconciling the man they thought they knew with the monster now revealed. The hardware store closed indefinitely, its Christmas display half-assembled in the windows. The charities he had supported scrambled to distance themselves from his name. Friends and associates struggled to understand how they could have been so thoroughly deceived. The hardest part, said Pastor Robert Miller, who had served alongside Bennett as a deacon at First Baptist Church, is accepting that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles at you across the communion table for 30 years, and you never see it for what it is. As 2025 drew to a close, the town that had been defined by an unsolved murder for 36 years now faced a new identity, as the community that had harbored a killer in its midst, never suspecting that the man helping to keep Jessica's memory alive was the very one who had taken her life. The morning of December 4, 2025, dawned clear and cold in Marlinton, frost etching delicate patterns on windows throughout town. At 6:15 a.m., as the first hints of daylight touched the mountains surrounding the valley, 6 police vehicles silently converged on Roy Bennett's Maple Street home, their lights off, their approach calculated to prevent any possibility of escape. Lieutenant Sarah Matthews stood on Bennett's front porch, flanked by 4 officers in tactical gear. The knock was firm, authoritative, the kind that leaves no doubt about its official nature. 30 seconds passed before lights flickered on inside. Another minute before the porch light illuminated the officers waiting with grim determination. When Bennett opened the door, still tying his bathrobe, Matthews would later recall a moment of eerie calm, as if he had been rehearsing for this moment for 36 years. Roy Bennett, you are under arrest for the murder of Jessica Winters, Matthews announced, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. You have the right to remain silent. As officers secured his hands behind his back, Bennett's only response was a resigned nod. No protest of innocence, no shock or outrage, just the quiet acceptance of a man who had always known this day might come. I always wondered if this day would come, he reportedly said as officers led him to the waiting patrol car. Took you long enough. Word of the arrest spread through Marlinton with the efficiency that only small towns possess. By 7:30 a.m., a crowd had begun to gather outside the sheriff's department. By 9 a.m., when Catherine Winters arrived accompanied by her son Michael, who had flown in from Ohio overnight, the crowd parted silently to let them through, a gesture of respect for the woman who had never stopped waiting for this moment. Inside, Sheriff David Harrison personally escorted Catherine to his office, where Lieutenant Matthews waited to formally inform her of Bennett's arrest and the evidence that had led to it. When Lieutenant Matthews told me they had him, that it was Roy, I felt my knees give way, Catherine would later tell the Pocahontas Times. For a moment, I thought I was having a heart attack, but it wasn't pain I was feeling. It was 36 years of tension finally releasing from my body. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for December 18th, giving prosecutors time to organize their substantial evidence and the defense time to prepare. The Pocahontas County Courthouse, which normally handled property disputes and minor offenses, now faced the most significant criminal proceeding in its history. Court officials, anticipating unprecedented attendance, arranged for video feeds to be set up in the courthouse annex and the high school auditorium. Local businesses closed for the day. Schools declared a professional development day for teachers, knowing that attendance would be minimal regardless. By 8:00 a.m. on the day of the hearing, every seat in the courthouse was filled. The crowd outside stood shoulder to shoulder despite temperatures in the low 20s, watching proceedings on hastily erected screens. Former Sheriff Dale Morgan, now using a walker, had been given a reserved seat in the front row beside Catherine Winters. When Bennett entered the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, a collective intake of breath was audible. The man who had sold them hardware, organized their parades, and sat beside them in church pews now stood revealed as the monster who had haunted their community for nearly 4 decades. "It was like seeing a stranger wearing Roy's face," said longtime resident Martha Wilson. The way he carried himself, his expression, it was like a mask had been removed. The evidence presentation was methodical and devastating. The DNA match, the fingerprint comparison, the timeline discrepancies, the trophies found in his storage unit. With each revelation, the case against Bennett grew more insurmountable. When prosecutors displayed photographs of the items found in Bennett's storage unit, Jessica's blue hair elastic and the Whitney Houston cassette case, Catherine Winters rose from her seat supported by her son. In a voice that carried throughout the hushed courtroom, she addressed Bennett directly for the first time. "I bought her that cassette for her birthday," she said, her voice unwavering despite her age. "You didn't just take her life. You took her future. You took our joy. And you sat across from me at church potlucks and pretended to care." Bennett did not raise his eyes to meet hers. Judge William Harrington, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the moment, allowed Catherine's statement despite procedural irregularity. When she finished, he called for a 15-minute recess, during which Catherine was escorted to a private room to compose herself. The hearing concluded with Bennett being held without bail pending trial. The judge granted the defense motion for a change of venue, scheduling the trial to take place in Charleston the following April, 37 years after Jessica's murder. As Bennett was led from the courtroom, the silence that had prevailed throughout the proceedings gave way to a collective exhale, as if the town of Marlinton had been holding its breath for 36 years and could finally release it. Outside the courthouse, Catherine Winters stood on the steps, supported by her son and surrounded by friends who had stood by her through decades of waiting. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting her silver hair. "Jessica has justice now," she told the gathered crowd and cameras. "Not the justice that would have given her back to us, but the justice of truth, the justice of knowing. Jessica has justice now," she told the gathered crowd and cameras. "Not the justice that would have given her back to us, but the justice of truth, the justice of knowing." For Marlinton, the arrest and preliminary hearing marked the beginning of a healing process that would take years. The community that had been defined by an unsolved murder could now begin to redefine itself, not forgetting Jessica Winters, but remembering her without the shadow of an unknown killer lurking among them. "We can finally say her name without that question hanging in the air," said Pastor Robert Miller at a community service held that evening. "We can finally grieve without fear. We can finally move forward, carrying her memory with us but leaving behind the darkness that has surrounded it for too long." The trial of Roy Bennett concluded on April 17, 2026, exactly 37 years to the day after Jessica Winters' body was discovered in the Greenbrier River. After deliberating for just 4 hours, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Bennett to life without possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under West Virginia law. For Marlinton and Pocahontas County, the resolution of Jessica's case marked both an ending and a beginning. The community that had lived for nearly 4 decades under the shadow of an unsolved murder could finally close that chapter, but the impact of those years, and the shocking revelation of the killer's identity, had permanently altered the fabric of the town. Marlinton will never be the same, reflected Mayor Patricia Collins at a town meeting held after the verdict. But perhaps we shouldn't be. Perhaps this is an opportunity to become something stronger, more vigilant, more compassionate. The case transformed how rural West Virginia approached cold case investigations. The West Virginia State Police expanded their cold case unit, allocating additional resources specifically for unsolved rural crimes that had previously received less attention than their urban counterparts. The Jessica Winters Protocol was established, mandating regular review of cold cases with modern forensic techniques and requiring that all alibis in major cases be thoroughly verified, regardless of the subject's standing in the community. What happened in Pocahontas County could have happened anywhere, noted State Police Commissioner James Harrison. Small towns across America have unsolved cases where familiarity and community standing may have created blind spots in investigations. Jessica's case reminds us that no one should be above scrutiny when a life has been taken. For the residents of Marlinton, the case left a complex legacy. The betrayal by someone they had trusted and respected forced a painful reassessment of community dynamics. Yet it also strengthened bonds as people processed their shared trauma together. The hardware store that had been Bennett's business for decades was purchased by a cooperative of local residents and renamed Winter's Supply in Jessica's honor, with a portion of profits supporting scholarships for local students pursuing careers in criminal justice or forensic science. The Greenbrier River Trail, once avoided after Jessica's murder, became a place of remembrance and reclamation. An annual memorial walk, led by Catherine Winters until her passing in 2027, continues today, drawing participants from across the state. Perhaps most significantly, Jessica's case changed how the community understood itself. The narrative of Marlinton shifted from a town defined by an unsolved tragedy to one defined by persistence, resilience, and ultimately, justice, however delayed. "We are not just the place where a terrible thing happened," said Hannah Roberts, Jessica's childhood friend, at the dedication of a memorial garden on the courthouse grounds. "We are the place that never gave up seeking the truth. We are the place where a mother's love proved stronger than time. We are the place where justice finally prevailed." As we conclude Jessica's story, we are reminded that cold cases aren't just files gathering dust. They're wounds in communities that never fully heal until the truth is known. If this case has moved you, please subscribe to Revealed Crime Cases for more stories of long-delayed justice finally being served. What case would you like us to cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten by time, because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every truth deserves to be told, no matter how many years it takes.